on Pontius Pilate, the scoundrel, right? The guy that washed his hands of the whole situation and walked away while our Lord was crucified. And before that was, he had him beat half to death. So he's a really nice guy, Pontius Pilate was. And we're going to learn about him. I did some research online just to show you I didn't just use the little cheat sheet book here. But of what Pontius Pilate was. Pontius Pilate, that Pontius, Ponti, was his surname, was his family name, okay? Back then, they used your last name as first name, and then your title. So he came from Italy, from Central Italy, from what I've been able to ascertain, and he served from 27 AD until 37 AD. For 10 years he served as they called it the private or perfect of Judea. He was assigned by the Caesar, which was Tiberius Caesar, and that he served for 10 years. And that was an unusually long period of time for a leader to be there in power on a province, because usually it was about a 2-year stint, and then they brought somebody else in. Is how the Romans did things back then. But for some reason, he got left there for 10 years. Okay, his most famous thing happened in AD 33. Now, what was that most famous thing that he did?
Washed his hands.
Let's see where, and they crucified Christ because of him. Okay, that was the most, I call, infamous thing in the history of mankind right there. I think it was worse than World War II and Hitler. I think it was worse than any other injustice that was out there, was that they took a totally innocent man and crucified him just so that the people would shut up. Now, during this presidential campaign, there were some times there I might have done the same thing as him. It was like, shut up and go home, quit talking. But one thing we do know about Pontius Pilate, that was in 37 AD, which was 4 years after Jesus, that scandal took place which involved the killing of a large group of Samaritans, remember the Samaritans, by Pontius Pilate, because he thought they were about to have an uprising. So he went in there and he had them all killed. And as a result of that, Tiberius sends for him to come back to Rome. He was tired of it by then, and we're going to take you out, and now I'm going to do justice on you because you've been an evil ruler. Because he ruled with an iron fist. It didn't matter if you were Jewish or non-Jewish. Under him, he knew how to kill people. And that's what he did well. And today we're going to study what the Bible has to say about the times of Pilate and what he had done. So if you would, turn in your Bible to Matthew 27. Now, I could go through every one of the Gospels has a reference to the crucifixion and the trial and all that. And if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're almost carbon copies of each other in the books, with very little minor changes, but they are really agree quite well with each other. And no, that was 4 men, if you include John. You have 4 men there that that wrote at various times about what happened at the crucifixion and the trial. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 27, and we see in this is the whole part of the Bible as far as toward the crucifixion. Okay, Jesus was handed over to Pontius Pilate. Okay, that's what it's about. And it says, now this was after they took Jesus, from the garden, and they took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, and they had a little mock trial and accused him of blasphemy and being a rebel rouser, and but basically what it was is they were afraid he was taking over, and they didn't want to give up their leadership. Was what it was all really about as far as human side of that. But after they got through with doing that, they took him to before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was absolute ruler over Judea during that time. Okay? He didn't have to wait on a message from Rome or go to a certain king or anything like that. He made the decisions and they went by it. If they didn't like it, they could write letters to Rome and everything, and they would be looked into, but he was absolute ruler. Okay, starting with verse 1 of Matthew 27. When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Okay, we go down to verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, it is as you say. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. So everything that was asked of him, did you really go out and do this and that? Are you a liar? And all the cheaters and all that you said, he answered nothing. He told him what you said. Yes, I'm king of the Jews. Okay. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not a word. So the governor marveled greatly. Okay, and next it's the governor asked them that who would you rather me crucify? Would you rather me crucify Barabbas or Jesus? Barabbas, I can't find any fault in him. There's nothing he's done against the law. Or Barabbas, this guy was a bloodthirsty killer that was robbing people and killing people, and he was just a lowlife. America's Most Wanted type guy, I guess today is what you'd say. So in verse 15, now the feast of the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one who they wished. And at that time they had a notorious preacher called Barabbas. Therefore, when he had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. That's why they were getting rid of him. They didn't like him getting power. Verse 19, while he was still sitting on the judgment seat, his wife said to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." So that's your wife giving you advice, and he should have took it. Verse 20, but the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release to you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate then said to them, what then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said to him, let him be crucified. In other words, they're the mafia and they want to rub out the competition. Okay, that's what's going on here. Then the governor said, why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, saying, let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, that he took water and washed his hands before the people and saying, I am innocent of the blood of this person. You see to it. And all the people answered and said this to him, his blood be on us and our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had been scourged, he delivered him to be crucified. Okay? In that sense there was that he gave a guilty man freedom. He took a good man and consented to his death. But one thing that never has set well with me on Pilate was, well, why did you have to go beat him half to death before you brought him forth? You know, scourging was considered the second death as far as corporal punishment in those days. So before he took him, had him crucified, he took him and he gave what they call a cat of nine tails, which was leather strips that were bound together like a whip would be. And it would have little shards of glass or little metal pieces in it, and they would beat them. And the Roman rule was you gave them 39 times if you got hit by the thing. Couldn't do it 40 because that was against the law. So now, if you were standing there getting beat with this thing, would you want 39? Can you imagine what it would look like? Now, you guys know that I used to be a paramedic in the fire department and all that, and I've seen some pretty severe injuries. But it would be just ripped, his skin on his backside, wherever it hit, wherever that whip hit, it would have been ripped open, literally. And his blood would be flowing. And he would have probably, if he didn't bleed to death, which they didn't do any kind of care for him, if he didn't bleed to death from that, more than likely infection would have set in and he died of gangrene not soon afterwards. But that's not the way God wanted him to die. He wanted to die on a cross. So he gave him over to, Pilate gave him over. Okay, let's look. The Luke 23. Let's go to Luke 23. Going to verses 6 through 12. All right, what happened here was that Pilate, before he crucified him, before he did that, somebody had mentioned that Jesus was from Galilee. And that he'd been going around spreading all this false doctrine and telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar and made up all his lies and all about him. And when Pilate heard that Jesus was from Galilee, he said, oh, here's my chance to pass the buck. Because there's a ruler over Galilee called, who is it? We went over it a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago. Herod. He was the king over Galilee. So as soon as, here starting in verse 6, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked the man that if he was Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, and he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard of many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt, mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. So after that, Pilate and Herod became good friends because they got to share the misery together. Okay? So when he comes back from Herod, in verse 13 of Luke 23, Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and rulers and the people, said to them, "You have brought us this man to me, and is one who misleads the people, and indeed I have examined him in your presence. I have found no fault in this man concerning those things which you have accused him of. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death was done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him, for it was necessary for him to release one to the feast." And then they went into, again, the Barabbas thing. So this was Luke's account. We see in Luke's account the difference is he gave detail of them being two different hearings, one before Pilate, one before Herod, both of them finding him not guilty. So there we see that Barabbas being released, and then Jesus being crucified, and Pilate washed his hands up. So look, he's not guilty. Why don't y'all go kill him? Kill him your own self. And they said, "Oh, we can't do that. We're the Sanhedrin. We can't kill. Our law says we can't kill anybody. That's why we brought him to you." Now, they hypocritical there. We want him dead, but we'll let you do it. And for that reason, then we see that Pilate, from now on through history, was considered a wicked king. But was he totally wicked? If he'd been totally wicked, he wouldn't have even asked. They said, "Okay, we want him crucified." "Okay, up on the tree. Go nail him up. Let's go." But he didn't. Now let's go back to the Luke 27. Matthew 27 rather. And we see that whenever Jesus was being crucified, what happened there in verse 37, 27:37. Okay, so we'll start at 36. "Sitting down, they kept watch over him there, and when they had put up over his head the accusation written against him." And that accusation was, "This is King of the Jews." Well, that was a slap at the Sanhedrin. That was okay, I'm putting him on the cross, and I'll kill him for you if that's what you want, but you are the ones that are getting rid of your king, is basically what that meant. And they infuriated the Sanhedrin. You would put that. They went to him in protest and said, why don't you say he said he was King of the Jews? And he said, no, what I've written, I've written. That's what Pilate said, was that I'm telling you what the truth about the matter is. He's the King of the Jews and you guys are killing him. And so he wouldn't change it. So after he was crucified, after Jesus was crucified with the two people who were crucified with him, back in 2757, let's look at Matthew 27:57. Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate commanded that the body be given unto him. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone over it in the door of the tomb and departed. So there you see Pilate, after Jesus was killed, he gave it to a guy that appreciated the situation, the man he had killed, and gave him a proper burial. So that can show you there was a part of Herod that was humane as far as maintaining the dignity of the innocent that was killed. Now, we go back out in the secular world, we find out that 4 years after Pilate did this took place, the crucifixion took place, 4 years later, in 67 AD, Pilate was caught up in a scandal where he had killed a bunch of the Samaritans, like I said earlier, and he was called back by Tiberius back to Rome, and he never returned to Jerusalem again. That was the end of his reign. Tiberius Caesar summoned for him to come back because he'd heard what all had been going on there. But what happened on the way to Rome was that Tiberius himself died, the Caesar, and he was going to be judged by the new Caesar, who was Caligula. And then nothing else was written. There was rumors written, or people hundreds of years after it happened that said this is what happened to him, but he died in 67 AD. Pilate died. 4 years after murdering Jesus, he died himself. Okay? Now there's all kinds of online research you can do, and whether they're true or not, it's online. Okay? I ought to tell you something. And what I was researching was Wikipedia. Everybody knows they don't lie. That's the source to go to if you want to know about anything. You just go in and type somebody's name in there, and it'll go to Wikipedia and tell you all about them. Whether it's true or not, that's just, that's up to you. Well, according to Wikipedia, Pilate, that there was like 3 different things that happened. That Pilate converted to Christianity and became a Christian, and he was martyred. And the Ethiopian church, Catholic Church, proclaimed him to be a martyr and made a saint out of him. That's what one account was. And some of the writing, yes, sir.
In Jerusalem, there's a place of Dead Sea Scrolls, and in case it's not this side of that opening up there, they call the Shrine of the Book. And in the same vicinity, a huge stone-like thing unearthed by archaeologists, which they claim had Pontius Pilate at the other on that plaque.
Yeah.
And so it's been authenticated that he actually was.
Yeah, and there was one set of archaeologists that
52 years ago, if memory serves me right, was right in the same.
Right in the- yep.
Shrine of the book, it's like,
And really, all of his rule, Pilate's rule there during that time, very little documentation was made back in that time. So it went from time of Christ, the crucifixion, 4 years later, till 1961, when archaeologists discovered coins, Roman coins that were minted in Jerusalem that had the picture, the likeness, and the name Pontius Pilate. So before that, people say, oh, that's just a myth. That all this stuff about the crucifixion all didn't really happen. And that was the big argument by the people who weren't Christians. But once they established, like you said, that stone that had the inscriptions of it, and then you had coinage that they had found with Pilate that they tied two together. So that was one of the stories, was that he became a Christian and became a martyr. We have no proof of that other than some guy, Josephus, like 200 years after Christ, said that that's what happened. But then we got other accounts from the Italian side of the thing, was that when Pilate got back to Rome and was awaiting trial in front of Caligula, that he knew what a terrible guy Caligula was, and so he went out and he killed himself. So several of the historians point to the fact that he killed himself 4 years later. But there's no real concrete proof of where he killed himself. So again, it was humans saying stuff after the fact. There's also a story that he actually died in another part of Europe and was purposely buried in this ravine that was considered cursed land, and that you couldn't, nobody ever went there because they thought it was haunted and cursed, and it was bad luck to go there. Then they threw his remains into that ravine. But nobody today's ever found bones of anybody dating back to that in that part of the world. So there you go. That's Pilate. Anybody got any questions and comments? We're 30 minutes early again.
You're trying to win points, John.
Yeah.
So,
I needed them last night, all I could get, and they didn't come.
well, now, we're not going to justify Pilate. We're not going to give him a pass. But isn't it interesting? He just met Jesus, it would seem, and he's interviewed him and concluded the man's innocent, and he's done nothing deserving of death. And yet the ones that are calling for his crucifixion are the very ones that he came to be their Savior and their Christ. And they're rejecting him in the most horrific fashion. And they knew better. And another thing that's interesting about the chief priests is they heard what Jesus had said to his closest disciple, the apostle. And he said it many times. And yet even though he said, I will rise the third day after they crucify me, they didn't believe him, they didn't understand it, it didn't register with them. And so when he was raised and the women reported it, they were reluctant to believe it at first. But yet these chief priests came to Pilate and said, we heard what this man said, that he's going to rise the third day. They knew what he said.
Yep.
So, to me, it's remarkable that these people that hated him so much could understand what he said and know what it meant, but the people closest to him, it didn't register with them what he said or what he meant until after the fact. It's just really odd to see how human behavior.
It is, and you think about, he was the absolute ruler of that area, of Judea. And why didn't he, instead of going ahead and crucifying Jesus, why didn't he just tell those Sanhedrin, well, what about the ones I do found as guilty are you guys, and so I'm going to crucify you instead of him. That would have been the right thing to do, because they were the ones that were speaking out against Rome and all the stuff that they were accusing Jesus of doing. They're actually the ones that were guilty of it themselves. Yes, sir.
I think the account to me that I think really got Pilate in all this, yeah, he was trying to keep the peace and doing all that, but like you said, he was in other instances he wasn't afraid to, wipe out dissent, whatever. But in John's account, in John 19, it starts off with Pilate and Jesus talking to each other, and Jesus wouldn't answer. Verse 10, Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore he who has delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." They threatened his reputation. They threatened his standing, his job, really. They basically said, if you do this, if you let this man go, you're opposing your boss. You're opposing your emperor. And he knew that would be, if that was really the case, if he was really doing that, it would have been professional suicide, essentially. And
That's what, and he didn't want to make waves. That's
Right.
what, if you look in our government today, you've got these people that have been the head of a certain department or something in the federal government or state or local government. You've got these people that are in there in power for many years, but yet they're not doing anything. And that, you can go back to biblical times of Pilate. He was a bureaucrat that wanted easy going. He didn't want to cause no harm, didn't want anything to be brought back on him. Evidently, he loved being there in Jerusalem. Must have been much nicer than Italy, which I can't imagine if I had the choice of going on vacation to them, I probably would pick Italy. I'm not too appetized by the type of food that they had in that region, but the Italians pretty good. So that'd be my choice.
There's something else you said about Pilate a moment ago. You all have been a little bit perplexed. Why would he beat him half to death and then have him crucified? And from the Synoptic Gospels, it appears that he decided to crucify him and they said, before you crucify him, let's beat him half to death. But if you read John's Gospel, it's you get a different sense. Mm-hmm. It's almost like in that negotiation with these chief priests, mm-hmm. he had Jesus beaten and then brought him back before the chief priests. Yep. In other words, okay, if you're bloodthirsty, look at this. Behold the man. He's beaten half to death. Will this not satisfy you? I think probably that would be the easiest explanation. He was yep. trying to keep from having to actually crucify him.
Yeah, and you have to look at back in those times when the Roman times were, they made sport out of killing people. It wasn't just this. It's what the Colosseum in Rome was all about. Is they'd take people like the Sanhedrin or Jesus or whoever they didn't like, and they'd say, okay, well, we're going to put a chain on your leg and chain you to the floor over here. We're going to let a wild lion come in. If you beat that wild lion up, you can live. If not, he's going to eat you. And so they did that, and they're all cheering and all. It's like Ultimate Fighting Championships, bloody. Can you imagine going to that? Hey, let's go watch a person get mauled by a lion. Man, that's cool. But that was their way of thinking back then. To us, society kind of gotten more humane over the years on certain things like that. But it's so close that we could get into that again. In fact, I saw on the news a couple of days ago where they're starting to have mock gladiators, and they're going to be performing in the Colosseum over there. And you can go there and watch this act of these gladiators fighting. Now, that's real close to the real thing right there, so it could very easily be. And hopefully it's not. Hopefully we as Christians are not going to be part of a cycle like that. They used to bled to death. I've seen plenty of people, and I'm sure Mark has too, seen plenty of people that died of trauma. Have you ever, in your life, I can't remember any call I went on where the person died on me, that they were able to speak, able to carry on conversation. But look at that account of Jesus telling John, his beloved, here, you take care of my mama, I'm fixing to go, I'm fixing to die. Now, he's bleeding out. He started losing body fluid in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember, he was bleeding as if it were great drops of blood. And then, surely, when they placed the crown of thorns on top of his head and beat him with reeds over the head, that would have taken all those splinters and just gouged him in his head. And believe me, the human skull, this part of the skull, it bleeds profusely. Because all the blood vessels are just right there at the surface. And if you see somebody that looks worse than they really were, that's because it bleeds a lot. You've been losing a ton of blood. And the scourging with all that meat ripped off of him. Think about the kidney areas and the lungs and all that stuff where the trauma would have gotten it. But there at the end, he's given his mother to John the Beloved, and then he calls out, into your hands, Father, I commend my spirit, and he dies. That is not a man that bled to death, or he's not a man that died of asphyxiation. He was fully conscious up until the time he died. So think about that when you're taking the Lord's Supper. Who killed Jesus? Was it those Jews? Was it Pilate? Was it those soldiers that killed him? Or did he die because of our sins? That's the real reason that he died. Because he could have called 10,000 angels to set him free and destroy the world, but he chose to die. Why? Because God the Father set down that that's what had to happen. That's what fate we have. So with that, that's all I've got. Anybody else want to talk about anything? Oh, I do want to talk about something since I'm up here. Last week, we put our house on the market over in Marietta, and we're trying to sell that house, and we want to move out here so we can be more involved with you all. Because when you're going 27 miles back and forth, it's kind of hard to go to all the other little events, especially when you're on fixed income like we are. And fixed, I mean low income like we are. So, so please keep my family and I in your prayers, and pray for my grandsons, because I'm working them to death out there doing stuff, and Patrick has really taught them well, especially the carpenter.